Go ahead, say it louder so everyone can hear you," my daughter-in-law said with a bright smile as she raised her glass. And for a brief second, the entire table leaned into the moment as if expecting something light, something celebratory. But instead, her voice carried just enough sharpness beneath the sweetness to change the air around us. As she continued to the old lady who was going to finally let the next generation take over, and the words landed softly in sound, but heavily in meaning, lingering longer than any toast should, stretching across the neatly set table where plates of untouched food sat cooling under warm afternoon light. A few guests laughed, not because they found it funny, but because they did not know what else to do, their smiles uncertain, their eyes shifting quickly between me and her, trying to understand whether they had just witnessed a joke or something else entirely, and I could feel that shift immediately. Not in the volume of the room, but in the way attention subtly redirected itself, in the way I was no longer part of the celebration but somehow placed just outside of it. My grandson sat at the end of the table, too young to understand the weight of what had just been said, his small hands wrapped around a cup, his eyes bright with the kind of joy that has nothing to do with adult conversations, and for a moment that contrast was almost enough to soften the edge of the moment. Almost enough, but not quite. I did not react, not because I did not understand, but because reaction would have shifted the focus in a way that did not serve me. And instead, I allowed the silence to settle naturally, letting the moment reveal itself fully without interruption. Because when people choose to speak in front of others, what they reveal is rarely just about the words themselves. It is about what they believe those words will do. My son sat beside her, his posture slightly stiff, his expression caught somewhere between discomfort and restraint, as if he had not expected the exact phrasing, but was not prepared to challenge it either. And I noticed how he avoided looking directly at me, choosing instead to focus on the table, on his plate, on anything that did not require acknowledgement of what had just taken place. The guests slowly returned to their conversations, the rhythm of the lunch attempting to reestablish itself. But it was not the same rhythm. It was quieter, more careful, as though everyone present had adjusted their awareness just slightly, enough to recognize that something had shifted without fully addressing it. My daughter-in-law lowered her glass with the same composed confidence she had raised it with, her expression unchanged, her posture relaxed, as if she had simply fulfilled a role she believed was hers to play. And I watched her for a moment, not with offense, not with anger, but with a clarity that had been forming long before this lunch had been planned. I picked up my fork, took a small bite of food that I could not quite taste, and allowed the moment to pass without comment, because there are times when silence is not weakness, it is structure. It is the space that allows everything else to take shape. And as the conversation around me continued, I understood with complete certainty that what had just been said was not the beginning of anything new. It was the exposure of something that had already been there, waiting for the right moment to be seen, and now that it had been placed in front of everyone, it would not disappear. No matter how quickly the room tried to move past it, the conversation slowly resumed around the table, but it no longer carried the same ease it had before. Each voice slightly measured, each laugh just a fraction delayed, as though everyone was adjusting to something they could not quite name. And I noticed how the space around me had shifted in a way that did not require words to confirm it. My daughter-in-law leaned back in her chair, her expression relaxed, her attention moving easily from one guest to another, continuing the role she had set for herself, as if the moment she created had already been filed away in her mind as harmless, even justified. And I understood then that what she believed about me was not something that had formed in an instant. It had been built gradually, reinforced over time, shaped by small assumptions left uncorrected. My son finally spoke again, directing his attention toward the guests across from him, asking a question about work, about travel, anything that could move the focus away from what had just occurred. And although his tone was steady, there was a restraint in it that had not been there earlier, a carefulness that revealed more than any direct acknowledgement could have. I remained engaged in the conversation when it reached me, answering politely, responding as I always had, because there was no benefit in withdrawing. No reason to step outside of a space I had every right to occupy, and yet I could feel how differently I was being observed now, how the perception introduced by a single sentence had begun to take shape in the minds of those around the table, quietly influencing how they interpreted every gesture, every pause, every word. One of the relatives attempted to lighten the mood, making a comment about how families always have their moments, their tone intentionally casual, but the effort only highlighted the underlying tension, not removing it but drawing attention to its presence in a more subtle way. And I allowed that attempt to pass without correction, because correction would have required engagement on a level that was not necessary yet. My daughter-in-law reached for her glass again, taking a small sip, her movements composed, controlled, and I noticed how she did not look toward me, not out of avoidance, but out of certainty, the kind that comes from believing that a position has already been secured, that the narrative she had presented would stand without challenge. My grandson's laughter broke through the quiet once more as he spoke excitedly about a gift he had just opened, his voice bright and unfiltered, and for a moment, the table responded naturally again, smiles returning, attention shifting toward him. And I watched that shift carefully, because it revealed something important, that the room was still capable of resetting itself, of moving forward, even while something unresolved remained beneath the surface. I set my fork down gently, not drawing attention, simply marking the end of a meal I had barely tasted, and as I looked around the table, I understood with complete clarity that what had just taken place was not an isolated moment. It was a reflection of a belief that had been allowed to exist unchallenged, and now that it had been spoken openly, it would continue to shape everything that followed unless it was addressed, not through confrontation, not through emotion, but through something far more precise. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate, my movement steady, deliberate, because timing matters in moments like this. Not immediate reaction, but measured response. And as the conversation continued without me for a brief moment, I allowed that distance to form, intentionally, not as withdrawal, but as preparation, because I knew that what came next would not be about correcting a sentence. It would be about revealing a structure, something that could not be dismissed or reinterpreted once it was fully seen. And until that moment arrived, silence remained not just appropriate, but necessary. The rhythm of the lunch continued to rebuild itself in small, careful pieces, but beneath that surface, something had already taken root, something that no amount of polite conversation could fully cover. And I could see it in the way people listened more closely now, in the way pauses lingered just a little longer than they should have, as if everyone was quietly recalibrating what they thought they understood. My daughter-in-law leaned into a new conversation, her voice light, her tone confident, guiding the discussion toward topics that felt safer, more neutral, and I recognized that shift, not as avoidance, but as control, the kind that redirects attention before it has a chance to settle somewhere uncomfortable. My son followed her lead, nodding along, adding comments where needed, his posture more relaxed than it had been moments earlier, yet still not fully at ease, as though a part of him remained aware of what had happened, even as he tried to move beyond it. I listened without interruption, allowing their words to fill the space while I observed the structure forming around them, because what interested me was not what they were saying now, but what they believed had already been established. the version of me that had just been presented and quietly accepted by those who did not have reason to question it. One of the guests glanced toward me again, their expression neutral but attentive, as if waiting for something, perhaps a reaction that would confirm or challenge what they had just heard. And when none came, that absence became its own kind of confirmation, reinforcing the narrative without needing to be spoken. My daughter-in-law smiled easily as she spoke, her gestures controlled, her tone steady, and in that composure, I saw the confidence of someone who believes the room has already aligned with her perspective, that the moment she created had settled exactly as intended. I reached for my glass of water, taking a slow sip, not out of necessity, but to mark the passage of time in a way that did not draw attention, and as I set it down, I allowed myself to look more directly at her, not with challenge, not with emotion, but with clarity. Because clarity has a way of revealing itself even when it is not expressed in words. She did not return the look, not immediately, and that hesitation, small as it was, told me more than any direct exchange could have. It suggested that somewhere beneath her certainty, there was awareness, not fully formed, not yet acknowledged, but present. My grandson's voice rose again as he called for another slice of cake, his excitement cutting through the layered atmosphere of the table, and for a moment, everyone responded naturally, laughter returning more easily, attention shifting away from anything that required deeper consideration. And I let that moment unfold, because it provided exactly what was needed, a natural pause, a space in which the tension could settle just enough to prepare for what would come next. My son reached for the serving plate, handing it down the table with a small smile, his movements careful, deliberate, and I could see that he was trying to restore something, not just the mood, but the structure of the gathering itself, as though by continuing in a familiar pattern, he could return everything to where it had been before. But I understood that what had shifted could not be undone by routine, because once a belief is spoken aloud, it changes the way everything else is interpreted. I placed my hands lightly together in front of me, my posture unchanged, my presence steady. And as I looked around the table once more, I knew with certainty that the moment to speak was approaching, not out of reaction, not as a response to what had been said, but as a continuation of something that had already begun. Because silence has its purpose, but only until the structure it protects is ready to be revealed, and I could feel that moment drawing closer with each passing second. The moment arrived without announcement, not marked by a sudden silence or a shift in attention, but by a natural pause in conversation. The kind that happens when everyone has spoken just enough and is waiting, whether they realize it or not, for something to fill the space. And I allowed that pause to settle fully before I spoke, not raising my voice, not changing my posture, simply adding my words into the room with the same calm presence I had maintained from the beginning. I mentioned, almost casually, that I had finalized a few arrangements earlier that week. Small updates to certain accounts and properties, nothing urgent, nothing that required immediate attention, and yet the effect was immediate, not in what people said, but in how they listened. The subtle shift from casual engagement to focused attention, as though something in the tone itself signaled that what followed would matter more than what had come before. My daughter-in-law's expression did not change at first. She continued to hold her glass lightly, her posture relaxed, but her gaze moved toward me more directly now, no longer avoiding, no longer assuming, but measuring. And I recognized that change as the beginning of awareness, the quiet recognition that something outside of her expectation was entering the conversation. My son looked up as well. His attention immediate. His earlier effort to maintain the rhythm of the gathering momentarily set aside, replaced by a focus that was no longer performative but genuine. I continued without pause, keeping my tone even, explaining that the structure of certain assets had always been designed to remain stable, to ensure continuity across generations without unnecessary disruption, and as I spoke, I could see how the language itself began to shift the atmosphere, moving it away from casual interpretation and into something more defined, something that required understanding rather than assumption. One of the guests leaned slightly forward, their interest no longer passive, and I noticed how even the smallest details, the mention of dates, of arrangements made years earlier, began to connect in ways that had not been considered before, forming a pattern that could not be dismissed as easily as a passing remark. My daughter-in-law set her glass down quietly, her movements controlled but no longer effortless, her attention fixed now. And in that stillness, I saw the moment where confidence gives way to calculation, where certainty begins to re-examine itself. My son did not interrupt, did not redirect. He simply listened. And in that listening, I saw that he was beginning to recognize the structure I was describing, not fully yet, not completely, but enough to understand that it extended beyond what he had assumed. I did not rush, did not emphasize, because emphasis would have suggested persuasion, and this was not persuasion, this was clarity, something that stands on its own without needing to be reinforced. I referenced the trust briefly, not in detail, not yet, but enough to place it within the conversation as something established, something intentional, something that had always existed, regardless of whether it had been discussed openly. And as that word settled into the space, I could feel the shift deepen. Not dramatic, not disruptive, but undeniable. My daughter-in-law's gaze remained on me, her expression composed but no longer certain, and my son's posture adjusted slightly, his attention narrowing as though he were aligning what he was hearing with something he had only partially understood before. The table remained quiet for a moment longer, the natural sounds of the gathering suspended just enough to allow the weight of what had been introduced to settle, and I understood with complete certainty that the direction of the conversation had changed, not through confrontation, not through correction, but through something far more precise, something that could not be undone once it had been recognized. And as I allowed that moment to breathe, I knew that what followed would not be a response to what had been said earlier, but a continuation of what had always been true, now simply made visible. The shift did not need to be announced. It settled into the table naturally, carried by the weight of what had just been introduced. And for a moment, no one reached to fill the silence, not because they could not, but because they understood that something more important was unfolding beneath the surface of a simple lunch. My son leaned forward slightly, his attention no longer divided, no longer guided by habit or expectation, but fixed entirely on me, as though he were trying to align what he had just heard with something he had never fully examined before. And I could see in that focus that the structure I had referenced was no longer abstract to him. It was beginning to take shape. My daughter-in-law remained still, her posture composed, but her expression no longer carried the same ease, the quiet certainty she had displayed earlier, replaced by something more deliberate, more careful, as if she were recalculating the position she believed she held within the family. I continued in the same measured tone, not raising my voice, not emphasizing any single detail, simply allowing the facts to exist in the space between us, explaining that the trust had been established many years ago, not recently, not in response to any current situation, but as part of a long-term structure designed to maintain stability. And as I spoke, I watched how each piece connected in their minds, how the simplicity of the explanation made it impossible to dismiss. One of the guests set their fork down quietly, their attention now fully engaged, no longer attempting to return to casual conversation, and I could feel the entire table shifting, not outwardly, but internally, moving away from the narrative that had been introduced earlier and towards something far more defined. My son's expression changed again. Not dramatically, but in a way that revealed recognition, the kind that does not come from being told, but from seeing something clearly for the first time. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more controlled, asking a question about how long the arrangement had been in place, not challenging, not dismissing, but seeking clarity. I answered simply, giving him the timeline without elaboration, because elaboration was not necessary when the structure itself was already clear. And as the words settled, I saw the final piece begin to fall into place for him. The realization that what he had assumed to be temporary or flexible had in fact always been defined, always been established beyond his interpretation. My daughter-in-law's gaze did not leave me now. Her attention steady, her expression composed but no longer certain, and in that stillness, I saw the shift fully take hold, not as resistance, not as denial, but as recognition, the quiet acknowledgement that what had been presented earlier at this table no longer aligned with reality. I did not rush forward, did not move to conclude the moment, because moments like this do not require force, they require space. The space for understanding to settle naturally, without pressure, without resistance. My grandson's laughter echoed softly from the other end of the table, a reminder of the reason we were all gathered. And for a brief second, the contrast between his innocence and the weight of the conversation created a clarity that extended beyond the immediate moment, something that reminded everyone present that what we were discussing was not just about control, but about continuity, about what is carried forward and how it is preserved. I rested my hands lightly together once more, my posture unchanged, my presence steady, and as I looked at my son and then at my daughter-in-law, I understood with complete certainty that the foundation of the conversation had shifted entirely, not through confrontation, not through correction, but through something far more enduring, something that did not depend on opinion or perception, something that simply existed and once seen could not be replaced by anything else. No one interrupted after that. Not because they were unsure of what to say, but because there was nothing left that could be said without first acknowledging what had already become clear, and I allowed that silence to settle fully, not rushing to fill it, not guiding it in any direction, because understanding, once it reaches a certain point, does not need assistance, it simply unfolds. My son leaned back slowly, his earlier forward posture easing into something more reflective, his gaze no longer fixed in confusion but shifting into recognition, the kind that carries a quiet weight, and when he looked at me again, there was a difference there. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, but unmistakable. A recalibration of how he saw me, not as someone positioned within a narrative, but as someone who had always stood outside of it. My daughter-in-law remained still, her composure intact, her expression carefully controlled. But the certainty that had once defined her presence at the table was no longer there, replaced instead by a measured stillness that suggested she was no longer certain of where she stood, and I could see how she was processing each detail, not dismissing, not resisting, but adjusting, aligning what she had believed with what had just been revealed. I continued speaking in the same calm tone, not extending the explanation unnecessarily, but clarifying one final point, that the trust was not something that could be redirected or reinterpreted based on personal preference, that it had been structured deliberately to remain consistent regardless of changing circumstances. And as I said it, I watched how that final piece settled into place, completing the structure in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. One of the guests shifted slightly in their seat, their attention still fully engaged, and I noticed how the room itself had changed, not physically, but in presence, as though the foundation beneath the gathering had been adjusted, creating a new balance that everyone could feel even if they did not express it. My grandson continued speaking about his gifts, his voice light and unaffected. And in that contrast, I saw how clearly the moment had separated itself into two realities. One that belonged to him, untouched and simple, and one that belonged to the adults at the table, defined by perception, assumption, and now, correction. My son finally spoke again, but his words were not an attempt to regain control or redirect the conversation. They were quieter, more measured, acknowledging what had been said without needing to challenge it. And in that acknowledgement, I saw that the shift had fully taken hold. My daughter-in-law's gaze lowered briefly before returning to the table, her movements slower now, more deliberate, as if she were carefully choosing how to exist within this new understanding. And I recognized that moment not as defeat, but as adjustment, the necessary step that follows recognition. I did not press further, did not elaborate, because nothing more was required. The structure had been revealed completely, and once something is fully seen, it does not need to be repeated. I reached for my glass once more, taking a small sip, my movements unchanged, my presence steady. And as I set it down, I understood with complete certainty that the moment had passed its turning point, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with clarity, the kind that does not fade once it has been established. And as the conversation slowly began to move again, more carefully now, more aware, I knew that what had shifted here would not return to what it had been before. Because once reality replaces assumption, it does not leave space for anything else. The conversation did not return to what it had been before. Even as voices slowly resumed and small exchanges began to fill the space again, there was a noticeable restraint now, a carefulness in how words were chosen and how attention shifted from one person to another. And I could see that the clarity introduced moments earlier had not faded. It had settled into the room, reshaping it in a quiet but permanent way. My son remained more reserved than usual, his posture relaxed, but his attention still anchored in what he had just learned, and when he spoke, it was with a tone that no longer carried assumption, only consideration, as though each word now passed through a new understanding before being expressed. My daughter-in-law participated in the conversation as well, but her presence had changed in a way that was difficult to describe yet impossible to miss. Her confidence no longer leading the room, her voice measured, her gestures controlled not out of ease, but out of awareness. And I recognized that shift as something deeper than embarrassment. It was adjustment, the natural response when perception meets reality and is forced to realign. I did not direct my attention toward either of them more than necessary, not because I wished to avoid them, but because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to reinforce. The structure had already been revealed in full, and repetition would only diminish its clarity. One of the guests attempted once more to bring the conversation back to lighter topics, speaking about upcoming holidays, about travel plans, and this time the effort found more success, not because the moment had been forgotten, but because it had been understood. And once something is understood, it no longer demands attention. In the same way, my grandson continued to enjoy his celebration, his laughter steady and unburdened, moving easily between the adults at the table without sensing the shift that had taken place. And in that innocence, I saw the true purpose of everything that had just been clarified. Not control, not ownership, but continuity, the quiet assurance that what mattered would remain stable regardless of how it was perceived. My son reached for his glass, his movements slower, more deliberate, and when he glanced toward me, it was no longer with avoidance or uncertainty, but with acknowledgement, subtle but clear, And I returned that acknowledgement with the same steady calm I had maintained throughout. Because acknowledgement does not require words when it is genuine. My daughter-in-law noticed that exchange, her gaze following it briefly before returning to the table, and in that brief moment, I saw something shift again. Not resistance, not challenge, but acceptance, the kind that does not need to be spoken to exist. The room felt balanced in a new way now, not as it had been before, but not unsettled either, simply adjusted, aligned with a reality that had always been present but had only just been recognized. I placed my hands lightly on the table, my posture unchanged, my presence steady, and as I listened to the conversation continue around me, I understood with complete certainty that what had occurred was not a disruption, but a correction, something that had been necessary for the structure of this family to remain intact. And as the lunch moved toward its natural conclusion, with plates being cleared and small goodbyes beginning to form, I knew that nothing more needed to be said, because the moment had already fulfilled its purpose, and what remained would carry forward on its own, shaped not by assumption, but by understanding. By the time the gathering began to dissolve into smaller conversations and quiet goodbyes, the atmosphere had settled into something steady, not the light ease it had started with, but something more grounded, something that no longer depended on surface appearances to hold itself together, and I moved through those final moments without urgency, acknowledging each guest with the same calm presence I had carried throughout, because nothing about what had taken place required further explanation. My son walked beside me as we stepped away from the table, his pace matching mine without hesitation, and for a brief moment, neither of us spoke, not out of discomfort, but because words were no longer necessary to bridge the space between what had been assumed and what was now understood. When he did speak, his tone was quieter than before, not uncertain, but measured, asking a simple question about whether I would be home later that evening. And in that question, I heard something new. Not obligation, not habit, but intention. The kind that follows recognition rather than expectation. I answered simply, confirming that I would be, and left it at that, because simplicity in moments like this carries more clarity than anything else. My daughter-in-law approached a few seconds later, her steps controlled, her posture composed, and when she stopped in front of me, her expression remained steady. Not defensive, not overly warm, but adjusted, as though she were navigating a space that had shifted beneath her in ways she was still learning to understand. She spoke politely, offering a brief remark about the lunch, about how everything had come together, her tone neutral, her words carefully chosen, and I listened without interruption, not searching for apology, not expecting correction, because what mattered had already been addressed in a way that did not rely on spoken acknowledgement. I responded with the same politeness, matching her tone without adding weight to the exchange, because there was no need to redefine what had already been made clear. She nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried more meaning than her words, and then stepped back, returning to the others, her presence quieter now, more aware of the space she occupied within the room. As I gathered my things, placing them carefully in my bag, I noticed how the remaining guests interacted differently, their conversations more balanced, their attention more evenly distributed, as though the shift that had taken place had extended beyond the immediate moment and into the way they engaged with one another. My grandson ran past me, his laughter bright and unaffected, and I placed a gentle hand on his shoulder for a brief second, a simple acknowledgement that required nothing more because his world remained untouched by what had unfolded, and that, more than anything else, was exactly as it should be. My son walked me to the door, opening it without hesitation, and as we stepped outside into the quiet afternoon, The contrast between the interior of the house and the stillness beyond it felt almost symbolic, as though everything that needed to be revealed had remained within those walls, leaving the outside unchanged. He paused for a moment, as if considering whether to say something more, but then simply nodded, a gesture that carried understanding without the need for words, and I returned that nod with the same calm steadiness, because acknowledgement, once it reaches that level, does not require elaboration. As I made my way down the path, the sound of the gathering fading behind me, I understood with complete certainty that what had been set in motion would continue without intervention, not because it demanded attention, but because it had already redefined the structure in which everything else would exist. And once a structure is seen clearly, it does not return to being invisible. The quiet of the afternoon stayed with me long after I had returned home, not as a weight, but as a clarity that did not need to be revisited in order to remain present. And as I moved through the familiar rooms, setting my things down, adjusting small details in the same way I always had, I understood that nothing about my life had changed, and yet everything had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Later that evening, my phone rang, and when I saw my son's name, I answered without hesitation, not anticipating anything specific, because expectation no longer played a role in what followed, and his voice, when it came through, was steady, quieter than usual, not burdened, but intentional, as if he were choosing each word carefully before allowing it to exist. He did not refer directly to what had happened, did not attempt to revisit the moment or reshape it through explanation. Instead, he spoke simply, asking about my evening, about small things, ordinary things, and within that simplicity, I heard the shift more clearly than any direct acknowledgement could have conveyed. I responded in the same calm tone, not reinforcing the change, not drawing attention to it, because once something has been understood, it does not require confirmation. It reveals itself naturally through action, through presence, through the absence of what once defined it. In the days that followed, that pattern remained not as an effort, not as something forced, but as a new alignment, one that did not rely on correction, but on awareness, and each interaction reflected that alignment in subtle ways, in pauses that were more thoughtful, in words that carried intention rather than assumption. In the absence of the quiet certainty that had once shaped every conversation, my daughter-in-law's presence in those interactions was equally telling, her tone respectful, her engagement measured, not distant, but no longer positioned as control. And in that adjustment, I saw that her understanding had settled as well, not through confrontation, but through recognition, the kind that cannot be reversed once it has taken hold. Time moved forward in its usual rhythm, days unfolding without disruption, routines continuing as they always had, and yet beneath that continuity, there was a stability that had not been there before, not because it had been created, but because it had been revealed. And once revealed, it no longer needed to be protected. It simply existed. When we gathered again, weeks later, the atmosphere was different in a way that did not need to be explained. Conversations flowed more naturally. Attention moved without hesitation. And the space that had once been defined by assumption now held something far more grounded, something that did not shift based on perception. My son met my gaze directly, without pause, without uncertainty, and in that simple act, there was acknowledgement, not of what had happened, but of what had always been true. And I returned that gaze with the same steady calm, because acknowledgement, once mutual, becomes part of the structure itself. My daughter-in-law stood nearby, her presence composed, her expression neutral, but within that neutrality, there was awareness, a quiet understanding of the space she now occupied. Not diminished, not removed, but aligned differently, no longer defined by control, but by recognition. I did not revisit the past, did not reference the moment that had reshaped everything, because it no longer held the same relevance. It had already fulfilled its purpose. And what remained was not the event itself, but the clarity it had created. And as I moved through each day, through each conversation, through each quiet moment that followed, I understood with complete certainty that what had been revealed would continue to define everything that came next, not through force, not through repetition, but through its own quiet authority, the kind that does not need to speak in order to be heard, and once established, does not need to prove itself again.